Thanks, Jim. Well, your lecture,
That's very good.
some fish out.
It's absolutely magnificent.
Oh, yeah.
Pretty fun.
Yeah, I hope they open.
There's another picture. Maybe through. It's amazing.
Who knows what the summer will bring?
What's that?
Who knows what the summer will bring?
That's right. All kinds of adventures.
Hopefully.
I was just dreaming of you and I in France,
Oh, my God.
you know, in the countryside.
Oh, that would be so beautiful.
Lovely spring day out there. A friend of mine saw some geese flying overhead yesterday. That's good. It's a good thing. So today I'm going to narrate. We've already begun to speak about the history of Christianity. We're going to see how, from being an obscure Jewish sect, Christianity became the religion and indeed the ideology which buttressed, which helped to support the dying Roman Empire. But I'd like to begin by doing yet another somebody wrote, Sarah wrote, I'm going to miss not stepping on goose poop, so on. Yes, that's a consideration. I lost my frame. That sort of threw me. But I want to talk about question 18, which asks you to outline the achievements of classical Greek civilization. Certainly the city-state itself is a fundamental achievement. The city-state, which was a planned city, the idea that the city could be planned in its development with all of the accoutrements, the baths, the gymnasia, the theaters and so on, that the elite at least could enjoy. And then of course, the development of the democracy within Greece with all its limitations. Obviously, the fact is that most people were excluded, but nevertheless, there was this idealization of the idea of popular government. Then I would say in terms of achievements, within this framework, individuals flourished, creativity was encouraged. And I do think that the environment that one lives in has a direct influence on the possibility of creative thinking, which leads me to say a city like Winnipeg, which is, from the point of view of planning, is a disaster. It's a terrible place, and it is a terrible place from that perspective because the so-called city fathers are basically real estate crooks. They control everything and they do whatever the hell they want. So that's why you get a city like this. But a city like the Greek city-state did encourage individuals to be creative. Nevertheless, I have to say that despite whatever the city fathers have done to this place, Winnipeg actually is a very creative place. There are a lot of people with a lot of interesting thoughts and imagination, and there are all sorts of things that happen in Winnipeg that are surprising in terms of what people can create. Well, with that message, my sermon for today is finished, and I would note that, of course, the Greeks in the Greek class in Athens, in particular, basically invented philosophy. I mentioned Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Especially notable their achievements in ethics, study of politics, and also with Aristotle, natural science. Then in mathematics, you have there was already a tradition in the 6th century, but the big name, of course, is Pythagoras and the development of geometry. In history, there is Thucydides. There are the achievements of classical sculpture and architecture. In architecture, it is the pillar and the lintel, which are the basis of building the temples, for example. And in sculpture, you have as what we call a heroic realism. It's the classical kind of sculpture that you have. And then there's, of course, theater, Sophocles, Aristophanes, and Euripides, both tragedy and comedy. Finally, in medicine, Hippocrates, a kind of empirical medicine develops, which actually cures some people. So that's what can be said in that respect. Now, I want to now move on and deal with the history of Christianity. We left off as the situation had developed just after the crucifixion of Jesus, 33 AD, and there he had already attracted a limited number of followers in Jerusalem, and his followers continued to live in Jerusalem. They continued to claim that Jesus, in fact, had been the Messiah, and that he would return at the right hand of God. That the last days were at hand, kingdom of heaven would shortly arrive, and the Messiah, who they saw as a kind of spiritual King David, would return to basically establish the kingdom of heaven. That was the belief. Now, these early Christians, as I have been insisting, were in fact Jews, and they continued to practice the Jewish religion, which, as a matter of fact, was more or less in the form that it has today. There are some changes, but basically we know that it had the form already of what it is today. Now, of course, the Orthodox Jews, who continue to believe that yes, there was a Messiah to come. Most of them thought that, but they were shocked and horrified by the idea that these Christians were saying that Jesus was the Messiah. And there was a lot of hostility and persecution in these early years. And the Christians, the new Jewish sect, some of its members, they They denounced the temple religion. There was a growing friction, and one of them, Stephen, was in fact stoned to death by a group of fanatical Jews. Now, the situation changed dramatically with the appearance of an individual who came from what is today Turkey or Asia Minor. He came from the big city in Asia Minor called Tarsus. It was the largest city in Asia Minor. He was a Jew from Tarsus. He apparently made his living as a tent maker. Tents were important in the desert and so on, and he made tents for a living, but he came from a very religious family, synagogue religion, Pharisaic, rabbinical religion. He spoke Greek, but also he spoke Hebrew, and also, which is the sort of religious language, but also the sort of common language that people in Palestine spoke, Aramaic. He knew Aramaic. And it seems pretty clear that he was also a Roman citizen. This is in the early first century. He was already, you could see the Roman citizenship, and the claim of Roman citizenship was important. Now, Saul went to Jerusalem to study, to continue his, I guess, rabbinical studies, you could say. And there he found that there was this heretical group, the Christians, and he was outstanding. And as a persecutor, he was in the forefront of the persecutors. And so much so that he was given the mission to actually travel from Jerusalem to Damascus, which is now in Syria, where there were already reportedly another group of Christians that established themselves in order to, his mission was to denounce these people and try to get the authorities to imprison them. Well, on the way to Damascus, on the road to Damascus, as it said, this Saul experienced a conversion. He had a conversion experience, some kind of religious experience. He was overcome. And he woke up as a Christian. He converted to Christianity on the road to Damascus. And in fact, he took a new name. His name was Paul, instead of Saul, which is a Greek. Eventually, he took this name, Paul, and he, having sort of recovered his wits, the church gave him the mission to go out and preach the new gospel of Jesus as the Messiah, especially in the Greek world, to leave Palestine and to go first into Syria and then into Turkey or Asia Minor, and eventually he wound up in Greece and in the Greek islands. And everywhere he went to the synagogues and challenged the Jews right in the synagogue, preaching the gospel, as they say. And at the same time, in something which was completely unprecedented, he also went into the market squares and he preached to the Greeks, to the Gentiles. He was preaching both to the Greeks and the Gentiles. And he, of course, found more success amongst the Greeks than he did amongst the Jews. As he went, though, he began to, thinking about Jesus, he began to develop new religious ideas, which became absolutely fundamental to the early Christian faith, to the Christian faith to this day, because basically he began to ask himself, well, why did Jesus die? Why was he crucified? And so on. And he came to the conclusion that Jesus had died as a result of sacrifice. He had sacrificed himself on the cross, and his sacrifice was redemptive in that those who came to believe in him would be washed clean of their sins. That Jesus' death and resurrection, if you believed, in effect redeemed you from sin. There was this idea of all who accepted Jesus, and it included both, it could be Jews, but it could be Gentiles as well, Greeks, would, as a result of Jesus' martyrdom, would basically be absolved of their sins, washed clean of their sins, and they would gain salvation in the other world. This is the big idea, and it's not an idea that it's Pauline, as we say. This is a new way of looking at it, and he said that it is this essential act of Christ's sacrifice on the cross, which abolishes the old covenant between Jehovah and the Jews and creates the new covenant. The new covenant is based on the crucifixion and redemption of Jesus. Creates a new covenant between God and all who believe in the sacrifices of Jesus. These thoughts appear in the so-called Pauline epistles, which are part of the New Testament. Well, one last feature that appears as well is Jesus was certainly a man, and all of the early Christians agreed to that. But Paul says that not only was he a man, but he insists on this idea of the Son of God, that there was a divine element to Jesus, that he was godlike, or a god, if you like. And that is a very Greek idea. I mentioned that when I was talking about the Greeks, how their heroes could become gods in their view. Well, Paul, who came from Asia Minor, from Tarsus, which was a Greek city, he picked up these ideas and now he Christianizes them. And so these are new ideas, but the main thing to come out of all this is that he universalizes Christianity. He takes it beyond Judaism, because it's very clear he's abolishing the old covenant, which includes circumcision, and that's important, and the dietary laws. He says none of this matters anymore. What matters is the new covenant, and which is open to both Jews and Gentiles, which is open to everybody who believes. It's universal. He universalized, I'll take it a step further. He universalizes Judaism. He transcends the Jewish framework and makes Christianity into a universal religion. And so, this is really an amazing development. And of course, as I said, he does this while continuing his missionizing in Asia Minor and Greece, in the Greek islands, and so on. Well, his ideas were, when he began to write about these ideas back to the church in Jerusalem, the leaders of the church, Peter and James, at first were taken aback. They couldn't believe their eyes, what they were reading. They were practicing Judaism and so on. And there was a struggle in the early church between what we call the Judaizers, those who basically in their thinking were conservative and they wanted to retain as much as possible the Jewish religion, and Paul's more radical approach to theology with all of its implications. There was this struggle. I should also mention that Paul wasn't the only missionary that was sent out, because we know of another missionary who's mentioned in the New Testament. His name was Thomas, St. Thomas, and he went, instead of going north to the Greek, to where the Greeks were, he went first of all to Ethiopia and then to India. And it's St. Thomas, who unfortunately we don't know very much about, who really created Christian churches in Ethiopia and India. And maybe some of you know, but Christianity has long been established in these places as well. It's a world religion, and it's not. We shouldn't be Eurocentric in our view of Christianity. This itself has some problems, but it's important to give credit where credit is due. In any case, Paul was ultimately arrested by the Roman authorities, brought to Rome. He was crucified between 59 and 67 AD, 59 and 67 AD. Now, if his death occurred in 67, that would have been in the middle of what we call the first Jewish revolt. That is to say, the Jews who were increasingly disturbed, finally in 66, rebelled against the Romans, and there was their rebellion lasted 4 years. Ultimately, was crushed by the Roman legions. But as a result of the destruction of these 4 years, and it is thought that hundreds of thousands of people died in this revolt in 66, 70. A lot of people fled Palestine in the face of these bloody events. And in fact, the leaders of the church decided to leave Palestine. So they crossed the Jordan River into Jordan to a place called Petra, which means stone or rock, Petra. It still exists, and there's a beautiful Christian church there. First of all, so the headquarters of the church was this place called Petra, and then ultimately they moved to Antioch and Alexandria in Egypt, did the early church. And from these cities that I've talked about, the Christian religion underground began to spread from city to city throughout the Roman Empire as the years went by. Especially it was slaves, craftsmen, and women who were attracted to this Christian religion. And what was preached in their little secret churches was basically universal salvation based on the teachings as they had been developed by St. Paul. Salvation by accepting Jesus would lead to redemption. There would be universal redemption, and the important thing to stress is this redemption would occur not in this life, but in the afterlife. They didn't have any idea that, there would be an imminent restoration of the Davidic kingdom. It was the idea of the idea became salvation in the afterlife. Now, the first mention of the Christians occurs under Nero, the burning of the city of Rome. There's accusations made that they are responsible, and they're hunted down in Rome, 68 AD. Then during the 90s, we have some comments by the rabbis that have survived. And again, there are denunciations of these heretics, these troublemakers, by the rabbis. And then starting more frequently in the 2nd century, the Roman authorities begin to mention these Christians as bizarre. They seem to be obsessed with the afterlife, and to a pagan Roman educated in the classics, it all seems very strange. And so there are these mentions of these people, and what's particularly objectionable from the point of view of the authorities is that they refuse to take the oath to the emperor. They refuse to accept, they refuse to sort of acknowledge the cult of the emperor and so on. And so there is from time to time persecution, although I would say that some scholars point out, well, for the most part, the Romans thought of these people as strange, but if they didn't make too much trouble, like the other mystery religions in the empire, they just let them alone, and there would be an occasional crackdown. That's the way I would put it. For example, at Smyrna in Turkey, Asia Minor, and at Lyon in southern France, in the late 2nd century, there were big crackdowns and even mobs who attacked the Christians. That's what the situation was during the 2nd century, the 1st century, basically in which Christianity began to spread. But more serious, from the point of view of the development of the church, was heresy. In fact, as the religion spread, people began to get different and, I'd say, strange ideas about Christianity. What was really the faith all about? And so we have, for example, in the 2nd century AD already, we have a heresy, a major problem that faces the churches, and there are already beginning to be bishops, leaders of the church. The church is still relatively egalitarian. The early churches, it was fundamentally, it was church of equals and so on, but there were leaders, and these people were called bishops, and by the 2nd century, they were achieving a certain authority. Well, there were these so-called Ebionites, and these people, they wanted to Judaize the Christian religion. Most of them probably were Jews who converted to Christianity, and they carried their traditions into the church. They wouldn't accept the sort of split between Christianity and Judaism. They tried to carry on some of the Jewish elements, and this was denounced by the leaders of the church. Another heresy, which is important in the early church, was the Gnostics. And the Gnostics were essentially small groups of intellectuals who thought they knew better, in the sense that, yes, they of course accepted the gospel narrative of Jesus and his teachings and what Paul had to say, but they said, you know, that behind all of this, there's really a secret teaching which is reserved for the elite. The common people can't understand this mystery, and we know, the intellectuals, what it's all about. And basically what these people tried to do was to incorporate Platonic ideas and Zoroastrian ideas of good and evil. Some people say even elements of Buddhism and Hinduism can be found in the Gnostic writings. They've left considerable literature, but the essential idea that was duality, that there was a fundamental split between good and evil in the world. In fact, history and earthly existence consisted of this duel to the death between good and evil. This was the teaching of the Gnostics. Well, this was rejected by the church, and because, as it was explained later, that Jesus was both human and divine. And if you sort of insist on an absolute split between good and evil, it contradicts what Christianity is about, the redemption of the flesh. And in some sense, though, because Jesus came to earth, here I'm getting into the theology, there's something divine even in because it's God's creation in the earth and in humanity. And so this notion of duality is unacceptable. And so this too was rejected. Well, as things progressed, it became important to clarify exactly what was Christian doctrine. The first person to actually write a credo, to explain what the basic elements of the Christian faith were, was a bishop. He was the Bishop of Lyon, and his name was Irenaeus. This dates from 177. This was he wrote the first credo of the Christian faith, explaining what the dogma was all about. But he was only the first of a number of intellectuals who, from that point onwards, would begin to write about Christian theology. And they're important because they, of course, they were explaining Christianity, but in explaining it, they introduced particularly Stoic and Platonic ideas into Christian theology. And in that way, it was important because these ideas, which were pagan, were incorporated into the Christian religion and survived into the Middle Ages. You know, during the Middle Ages, at first, you're talking about a dark age. Nobody knew anything. There was scarcely anybody who was literate. And so any survival of pagan antiquity is important. One of the more important individuals in this respect was Clement of Alexandria, who lived in the 4th century AD. And he was a Platonist. And he's in particularly important in terms of Platonizing the Christian religion. Now, all of these thinkers, and there's maybe about a dozen or 15 of them, these what we can say Christian intellectuals are called the fathers of the church, and they were educated in pagan philosophy, and they rationalized Christianity in these terms, incorporating a lot of classical learning in the process. Now, I want to speak about one other thing at this point before we move on, and that is sexuality. Now, the Jews were already different from the people around them in that, unlike the Greeks, the Romans, and the Philistines, and all the other people in the Middle East, those people had a much more relaxed attitude towards sexuality. Certainly, it was a sexuality which was male dominated. Women were completely subordinate, or almost completely subordinate. But um, basically, there was a relaxed attitude, and um, there was a lot of homosexuality, and um, also prostitution was widespread. Well, basically, the Jews were opposed to these things, and they believed in first of all, they believed in a patriarchal, dominant kind of religion, sexuality, and so on. But also, they eventually became monogamous. By the time you get to the synagogue, Judaism, starting in the third century BC, the rabbis are saying one man and one woman, and so on. So they were against polygamy. Well, I would say that women have no place. They're subordinate completely, except we do have from the 7th century BC, a woman by the name of Sappho, who lived on the island of Lesbos in the middle of the Mediterranean, and she wrote love poetry, and her love poetry is dedicated to other women. That's why we have this concept or the name lesbianism. It comes from Sappho. She was obviously some sort of aristocrat. In order to, first of all, she was literate, and she could get away with it because she was an aristocrat. Whereas if you were an ordinary woman, God help you. There was that, and then I mentioned the playwright Aristophanes, one of the great playwrights of the classical Athens, who wrote a play called Lysistrata, and in this, all the women of Athens go on sexual strike against the continuation of the Peloponnesian War. And it's quite a funny play, and it gives you a great idea about what people thought was funny. And at the same time, it does illustrate there was this, women were not entirely muffled, we could say. But again, to come back, I said that there was a certain relaxed attitude towards sexuality. Well, that changes with Christianity. Paul's comment is better to marry than to burn. That marriage is not good, but what is good is no sex. And that was in terms of Christianity, that was the basic attitude. Sex is bad. Except if you needed to procreate, or you needed to procreate, so you should always have sex for the purposes of procreation, but basically it was bad. Well, that's an amazing, and what is amazing about it's not so much these statements, but the fact that they were accepted. And whereas in the ancient world, in the classical world, the Greeks and the Romans, etc., sexuality was open and so on, the Christians did impose this deeply puritanical attitude towards sexuality, and it was accepted. And the interesting question is, why? Why did people accept this? And it does show, first of all, the power of these ideas, but also the change that Christianity represented. Something very fundamental happened to classical civilization as it was dying. And there is this qualitative change in morality and ethics that occurs. And of course, it has an enormous effect, this repressive attitude right down to the present. Although that leads me to say, I might as well say what I'm thinking. What I'm talking about can be illustrated by what we just saw in the last generation or so, where in the 1960s, famous sex, rock and roll era, suddenly all restraints were, or supposedly all restraints were thrown off, and sexual freedom became the cry, and that was very widespread in the world. No, it's not merely North America; it was everywhere, and it lasted for about a decade and a half, and suddenly, once again, a new Puritanism, a clampdown on everything, and new Puritanism, which was still with us, although it's somewhat inflected, let's put it that way. A new Puritanism develops in the wake of economic austerity, neoliberalism, but also feminism. What I'm trying to point out is that these kinds of changes in culture can occur, do occur, and we've had a recent example of that. Let's go back to the actual progress of the Christian church. Now, the Christian church did make a certain progress in the 2nd century, beginning of the 3rd century AD. But it's in the course of the 3rd century, which is, it's the end of the good times. The good times, which last till about the year 180 AD, come to an end. And following that, all hell breaks loose, as you'll see as we're discussing this. Really serious problems begin to develop. The basic problems that I talked about last time really come to the surface in the 3rd century AD. We're talking about the real beginnings of the decline of the Roman Empire in the 3rd century. Foreign barbarian invasion, economic collapse, and so on. Really bad times. And it's during this 3rd century that significant conversion to the Christian religion begins. In other words, more and more people turn to Christianity during the bad times of the 3rd century. Now, by the 3rd century, Christianity had grown very far away from Judaism. For one thing, for example, the ritual of the Christian religion had been paganized, or in other words, significant elements of Roman ritual and practice and Greek practice and belief were incorporated into the rituals of the Christian church. Secondly, as I explained, the fathers of the church, Clement of Alexandria, etc., had changed the theology and incorporated some elements of especially Stoicism and Platonism into Christian theology. Thirdly, from having been highly democratic, by the 3rd century, the bishops were emerging as powerful figures in their own right. They were a certain hierarchy developed in the church in the 3rd century. And these became the bishops, which the bishoprics were located all around the Mediterranean into the Middle East. The bishops were political figures. They were important political figures. And the church was now organized into dioceses and provinces, parishes, dioceses, provinces, the form that the Catholic Church still, the form of organizations the Catholic Church still has, had developed by the end of the 3rd century. Finally, the church began to get more and more property. How? Because more and more of the Christians began to leave land or money to the church in their wills. And so the treasuries of the church now began to get some real significance, especially because people were giving the church money because the church distributed most of it in the form of charity, and charity was urgently needed in the terrible times that now envelop the Roman Empire. In terms of which of the churches were most important, the most important church was Rome, but it was by no means the only important church. Alexandria, Antioch, sites of the early church, and there were several others. They too were important. I don't want you to think that the popes had already acquired the position that they were to acquire later on. That came later. There were several very important bishoprics in the early church. And of course, as I have been remarking, this sudden development of the church as a political institution in the course of the 3rd century was a response to crises. And the crises were basically the political crisis in terms of civil war between elements of the army. The legions were fighting one another for power. The barbarian invasions, the first wave of barbarian invasions, and economic collapse. All three were part of the crisis of the 3rd century. And during, so the church becomes more important, and it actually thrives as the Roman political empire is falling into crisis. The church gets stronger. People are turning to the church. At first, the Roman authorities, they don't know what to do in this situation, dealing with the church. And there is an emperor toward the end of the 3rd century who tries to put a stop to it. His name is Diocletian, and he's an important figure in his own right. But one of the things he does is he institutes the worst persecution of the Christians so far. I mean, it's systematic, and thousands of Christians are put to the death by Diocletian in order to stamp out what is considered to be the development of a state within the state. That is to say, there's a Roman state, but the church is emerging, the Christian church is emerging as a serious rival within the structure of the Roman state. And so he tries to root it out without success. In fact, the persecutions make the church stronger. And so his successor, Constantine, completely reverses the persecution. And instead of persecuting the church, he himself converts to the Christian religion and makes Christianity the religion of the state. He co-opts Christianity as a buttress of political authority. Really, this is an incredible event, because we know that it began as a persecuted sect, pure persecuted sect, popular amongst the underclasses, and now it's the official religion at the beginning of the 4th century AD. That's certainly incredibly dramatic. Likewise, the transition from being highly egalitarian, now it's a hierarchical religion. And from being persecuted, now when it becomes the religion of the state, it turns around and begins to persecute other people, including the Jews, of course. The Jews, of course, we know that, but now the Jews become systematically persecuted by the Christians. They become the other, and they remain the other until modern times. This is an incredible reversal also. What we need to do now is sort of more deeply understand the factors that were leading to the political and economic decline of Rome. And we'll do that first thing in the next class. Take a walk in the sunshine. Have a happy weekend.